My name is William Loopesko, but everyone here who knows me knows me. I was a graduate of the class of 2010, and I had all the bona fides of Acting Club President, Interim Director, the Sawyer Award winner, all that stuff. And so I'm super excited to be here. It's been really fun hanging out with everyone today. Honored and humbled to share with you this pretty awesome trip that I was able to take thanks to the Bates College Outing Club, and Bates College in general, this summer between my junior and senior year with my bro, Rusty. So anyways, but before we talk about any of that stuff, I want to talk about these three dudes. So these three guys are George Carmax, Skookum Jim, and Dawson Charlie, and they are the three individuals who, in the fall of 1897, discovered gold on the Klondike River in far northern Canada, in what was at the time the complete middle of nowhere. But that didn't last very long because news of their discovery quickly made it to the United States, and over 100,000 people, one of the largest mass migrations of human beings ever on the planet, started making their way north, and they climbed over the snowy mountains of the Coast Range, over the Chilkoot Pass, down to Bennett, British Columbia, on the other side, where they spent the winter camping out on this frozen cold lake. And then from there, they made their way through the treacherous rapids of the Yukon and finally made it to Dawson City, where the gold rush was, where it still lives. And so, that's the story. 111 years later, I was just starting my junior year at Bates, and like many of you in this room, the outing club was kind of my thing. A lot of hiking, a lot of canoeing, a lot of skiing, and a lot of general on-campus shenanigans. And one of my favorite partners in crime in all of this was this guy, Rusty Milholland, class of also 2010. And Rusty and I were both juniors, and we were both really excited for us applying for the Otis Fellowship. Does this thing still exist? Otis Fellowship? Yes? All right. It's awesome. The Otis Fellowship was endowed by the family of Philip J. Otis, class of 95. And it provides funding for non-academic projects that explore the relationship between nature and society, aka just go have fun and have an awesome adventure. It provides funding for up to $6,000 per person for an approved project. It's supposed to be per individual for an individual project. And it also sponsors lectures and events like the 90th BOC reunion, which was the last event that I knew about that it sponsored. I'm sure it sponsored many more since then. So Rusty and I both wanted to apply for this, and we decided that instead of competing against each other, we would just do it together. And we had to convince the Otis committee that our thing was something that needed to be done with another person. And so we settled on canoeing, and then I don't remember why we decided to go to the Yukon. So this was our plan. This is the Yukon Basin. It starts here in Bennett in northern British Columbia. It flows 550 miles up to Dawson. But that's only 2 weeks of canoeing, that's boring. So we decided to go an extra 1,400 miles through multiple towns, all the way to the Bering Sea for a total of 1,950 miles. Just so you can see a little comparison, it's like canoeing from North Carolina through the upper Midwest all the way to Colorado, but instead of cities and highways and farms, it's bears and woods and wilderness. So after a lot of planning and persuasion and maybe a little charm, we were able to convince the Otis committee that these two handsome dudes should go spend the summer in Alaska hanging out with bears. So once we got the grant, $12,000, we had to start the planning process. And of course, Rusty immediately went to Tanzania to study abroad. So that left me to do all of the planning by myself. And fortunately, Rusty's parents lived in Freeport, and they loaned me their garage as our staging area. And I spent a lot of time hanging out in there, packing and preparing gear, calling random grocery stores in random towns in Alaska to see what kind of food they had and how much it would cost us. And I also borrowed Rusty's parents' sewing machine, and I built a cover for our canoe. And finally, Rusty came back from Tanzania, and we loaded the canoe on my 1999 Dodge Durango that I had a mechanic in Lewiston assure me could make the drive to Alaska. And then we hit the road. Literally across the continent, we drove 4,000 miles in 6 days. We spent the first 4 days driving pretty much nonstop. This is us sitting in rush hour traffic in Chicago. And after 4 continuous days of driving, we had finally made it to the start of the world famous Alaska Highway, which is really beautiful. We took our time here, spent a couple days, still driving, but driving a little slower so we could see the awesome scenery. There's some great animals right on the side of the road. This one was maybe less welcome than some of the others. As we drove a little further north, the days started to get a little longer. This was on our last night of the drive at 11:30 p.m. And finally, we made it to the Yukon. They have this really classy sign. And from there, we made it to Carcross, Yukon, but we weren't quite done yet because the Yukon actually starts at Bennett. And Bennett, the only way to get there is on this train. So we put our boat and all of our stuff on this train. This was built by the miners to be able to ferry all their stuff over the mountains. And we ended up here. This was Bennett, 111 years before us. It's where the miners would emerge out of the mountains and put their gear to be able to head out towards the gold fields. It doesn't look quite like that anymore. Most of the buildings are gone. It's still really beautiful. But there's still a few old buildings, and so we climbed up to this old church, and then we turned around and had this amazing view out over the lakes and the wilderness that we had come so far to paddle. We had an awesome lunch provided to us by the White Pass Yukon Railroad Company. And then after that, we headed down to the shore and we started packing up all of our gear. Looks like a lot, but we were able to make it fit with this hand-sewn canoe cover. And we were really excited. We had come all this way to paddle on the Yukon. We've been thinking about it all of junior year, so we pushed off and immediately got stuck. It turns out the lake is pretty shallow at the beginning, but finally, we were able to get out on the water and start making some headway canoeing down the Yukon. Only 1,950 miles to go. So we paddled hard that first day and we made it to this island. We had decided that we should camp on islands every night to stay away from the bears. We kept a really clean camp that night, figuring that we should get into a really good habit of keeping a clean camp every night to try to keep the bears away. What sunset looks like at around midnight. When you're way up there, and then the next day we woke up to beautiful blue sky and mountains and sunny scenery, and we rigged up our pace flag on the back of our boat, and then we continued down the lakes. And pretty quickly we settled into a rhythm for how our days would go. We would wake up usually on a little sandbar. From there we might paddle for a few hours, we might check out some wildlife, we might check out some historical sites on shore, and then we'd stop for lunch when we got hungry, hopefully somewhere cool. This was a pretty cool log that we found. Then in the afternoon, we might paddle some more. It was often super hot by then, so we might go swimming. We might take a nap. And then we would at some point find another place to camp. Sometimes we were camped really close to the boat. Sometimes we were camped really far away. But inevitably every night we would cook on a fire that was made out of driftwood. We would alternate, and then after dinner we would hang out, soak in some more sunshine, maybe read the map, take some gear, prepare for the day ahead. This is what sunset looks like, and this is really what night looks like in Alaska. It wasn't all sunshine and roses the entire time. There were certainly some hazards. This was the biggest one. This was the one thing that kept our parents up at night. This was the one thing that had made the Otis committee decide that we should bring a shotgun with us. Thank you, Base College. This was the one biggest unknown that we had. The one thing that really had attracted us to this area because this was the first time that either of us had not been at the top of the food chain. And being in that kind of raw, untouched wilderness, while a little intimidating, is also pretty powerful. So there was also, we would try to camp on islands every night to try to stay away from the bears. But even on islands, we would see these enormous footprints. You could see owls dog footprints next to them. And this was a good reminder that bears actually can swim. So islanders were not necessarily guaranteed to be bear-proof. There's also some weather. This can always happen. Big thunderstorms would pop up sometimes directly on top of us, and sometimes there would be big fires, and the fires would obscure the weather so that on this particular day, day 31 of the trip, a massive thunderstorm erupted directly on top of us because we hadn't seen it because of the smoke. There was also the river. So the river, we had chosen it in part because it is very smooth and very flat, but it's also very fast. For the first 700 miles, it rages through the mountains, and there's huge waves and boils and eddy lines that, while they're not actually rapids, they can certainly tip a canoe pretty quickly, and so we had to be very careful of that. And we were constantly reminded of the power of the river because a month before our trip, there had been a massive flood that had wiped out many of the towns that we were in. On my screen. So yeah, about a month before we did our trip, there had been a massive spring ice out that had ravaged a lot of the towns that we were paddling through, and so we were constantly reminded by the presence of construction equipment that the river can indeed be a powerful beast. But for the most part, we had a great time, and it was awesome. So, despite those hazards. So after spending 4 days on the headwater lakes of the Yukon, it finally becomes a river, and we went through a self-controlled walk, which is a controlled dam for the White Horse Rapids through Miles Canyon. This is where many miners lost either their lives or their supplies and ended their gold rush dreams. The raging White Rapids reminded them so much of rushing white horses that they named the capital of the Yukon Territory Whitehorse at the town that was at the base of these rapids, where you could finally make your way to the gold fields after having survived this. Today, thanks to the power of modern technology, the rapids look like this because they put in a big dam in Whitehorse, and it's the only dam on the Yukon. We hit it on the first day, but it made this canyon passable for us, and then from there we just around the dam and kept going. And we went through Whitehorse, and the whole time we were up there, we were really reminded of many of the great authors and poets who had been. Does anyone know this poem? Yes? A lot of people. Great. So this is a cremation of Sam McGee, and of course it talks about on the marge of Lake LaBarge. Well, Lake LaBarge is actually called Lake LaBerge, and it looks like this. Robert Service had changed the name for creative license. This is the last of the major lakes that the Yukon flows out of. It's about 30 miles downstream of Whitehorse, and so we spent a lovely evening camped out on this cove on the shores of Lake LaBerge. And after dinner, we went for a hike, and you can see our typical hiking attire in the bear-filled woods of the Yukon. We always had bear spray and shotgun with us at all times whenever we left the safety of the boat. In case of unexpected bear encounters, we didn't have any, but we would have been prepared had we had any. So after Lake LaBerge, the Yukon flows through a lot of beautiful canyons and gorges, cool rock formations and mountains, and it's really just raging at this point as it makes its way down to Dawson. There's lots of historical sites along the way, and so we spent a really nice week just exploring all of this mining history before very quickly making it to Dawson. We only missed the gold rush by about 111 years, unfortunately. But Dawson looks like this today. 111 years before us, it looked like this. It had 50,000 people, a very active riverfront, even a couple opera houses. And so we were excited to be able to spend some time exploring it. So we shacked up at the Dawson River Hostel, where we enjoyed comforts of civilization like a sponge bath, because they didn't have a full shower. And then we paddled across the river, and we went to explore the town. The remnants of the gold rush are literally everywhere. I actually really like the message that is conveyed in this poem. We went to see a show. We got some dinner. Again, the gold rush, everything is historical, or what their version of history might look like. And then after dinner, we had actually planned this intentionally. We got there right on the night of the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. And so we headed up to Midnight Dome, the mountain that looks over the town of Dawson. And the entire town was up there, including all the tourists. And everyone is there for the main event, which is the sunset. So we watched it get closer, and then at 12:37 a.m., we watched the sun go down behind the mountains, and it came up like so here we could look out into the mountains and wilderness that we would be canoeing through in the next several weeks ourselves. Okay, so from Dawson, the river gets a lot wilder. There's a lot fewer people. There's still a lot of really cool history, some old mining stuff, some old ghost towns. Just a lot fewer people. Most people stop in Dawson. There's also some big mountains. 2 days outside of Dawson, we were going under this magnificent looking mountain, and we decided that it looked pretty cool and that we wanted to check it out. So we pulled ashore and walked through the woods until we got a nice view of it, and then from there we climbed up the tree line and followed the ridge out past a few summit cliffs to the top, where we could look out on 360-degree views of trackless, unnamed, untouched wilderness. We left our own very own tribute to the Bates Outing Club. And then from there we turned around and took a look at the river. 4,000 feet below the river that had become our home. And finally we headed down and piled into the canoe, pretty exhausted from our day, and enjoyed this beautiful sunset over the mountain that we had just crossed. And then the next day, we crossed into the United States. We actually had brought passports with us. We had our passports stamped by our border guards sitting on the dock in Eagle, Alaska. And then we entered Yukon National Park and Preserve, which is awesome. It's really, it's beautiful. And in this part of the Yukon, there are these awesome public access cabins that they make available on a first come, first served basis. So because it was the middle of nowhere, we were always first to come and first to serve. And we spent several nights hanging out in these awesome cabins. We spent one particularly rainy night hanging out in this 2-story Alaskan beauty, sitting by the fire and drinking whiskey and playing cribbage instead of being out in the rain. There's also some really cool history in this park. This is an old dredge. This was an early attempt at some industrial mining. There's a bucket line that we got to explore, and then we got to try to see if it still works. It doesn't. And then from there, the tailings make it through and get dumped out on the other side. And while this is really cool, it's also a little sad to see that in what's supposed to be a pristine, remote wilderness, we human beings have still found a way to completely leave a horrible scar that you can actually see from space. So, good reminder of how much we sometimes suck. After the Yukon National Park, we had been in mountains continuously for 700 miles in about 3 weeks. And then very quickly, the river opens up into this 250 miles of what's called the Yukon Flats. It's the largest swamp in North America, an area larger than the state of Massachusetts. The river swells up to about 10 miles wide and gets choked with islands and sloughs and channels that are ever shifting and constantly changing. The whole thing looks like this. There's really nothing there. It's the most complete wilderness I've ever experienced. Just trees and water and sky and lots of birds. We had no idea where we were for about 7 days. We just followed the current. Our maps were useless, but we just assumed that at some point the current had to go somewhere, and we might end up finally in those mountains that you can see way in the background. Because the river's so wide at this point, it gets really shallow. This is way above the Arctic Circle. Not way above, right at the Arctic Circle. So it's really hot, like 22, 23 hours a day, all day, every day. The temperature like never dropped below 90. So the river gets really, really warm, and what had previously been a cold mountain stream turned into like bath water that we would spend the rest of the trip swimming in today. After about a week in this swampy wasteland, the mountains finally emerged out of the swamp. In fact, we entered this really deep, tight canyon. We saw an old friend who welcomed us back. Turns out the old man just moved to Alaska for his retirement. And we also crossed under the bridge. So this might just look like a bridge, but this is actually a really important landmark because this is the last place that the connected North American road system touches the Yukon. So if we had wanted to escape in an easy, inexpensive way, this would have been it. After this, the only way out is on an airplane, and it becomes much more complicated and much more expensive. This is also the start of the Alaskan bush, though. So after this, the river becomes the primary mode of transport. We started seeing a lot more traffic, both commercial and what you could call occupational. The locals are still trying to maintain their subsistence lifestyle as much as they can. So we saw a lot of these things. This is called a fish wheel. And they sit in an eddy and they just scoop salmon out of the river into a bucket, and it's what they use to feed both their families and their dogs, which still remain a major form of transportation for them in the winter. So this section of river was awesome. The mountains were there. It was sunny. The camping was amazing. And we really just spent an amazing time going through here. It actually was so sunny and so hot all the time that we took off our watches. And for 3 weeks, we lived by the rhythm of our own bodies, having no idea what time it was, sunny all the time, so it doesn't matter. So we would just wake up when we felt like waking up, paddle until we were hungry, have lunch, paddle until we were tired, go to bed. Sometimes it might have been 5 p.m. when we went to bed, sometimes it might have been 3 a.m., hard to know. That was a pretty unique experience. But then as we started to get closer to the delta of the Yukon, the mountains start to get a little more barren, the weather starts to get a little more cold. We have to put our watches back on because evening starts to matter a little more as it starts to get cold. And the river gets really, really big. In fact, towards the end, the river's about 3 miles wide, so that we could almost never see the opposite shore, and we would just stick to the one shore. And so finally, after 6.5 weeks, we had made it to Pilot Station, Alaska, which was about 110 miles from Emonic, which was our final destination. That was the place where we could fly out. And the whole trip we had been talking about wanting to have a 100-mile day. For some reason, that seems like a major accomplishment. We had had some 50-mile days, some 80-mile days, but we had never crossed the 3-digit threshold and realized that this would be our last chance. So we loaded up the boat with food and gear and just enough fuel to keep us moving for about 24 hours is what we estimated. And we did an all-night marathon push to get to Emonic. We paddled through the evening, we paddled through the night. This is what night looks like. I did this for about 4 hours before the sun came back up. It doesn't really get much darker than this. This was the darkest night we had seen in a long time. And after about 23 hours, we had finally made it to the town of Emonic. But anyone who's paying attention will realize that there's a major problem. Emonic is not on the ocean. In fact, it's still about 12 miles away. So we passed out hard after being away for 24 hours, and then the next day we paddled out to where the land just ends, and we were able to look out at the Bering Sea, and we had finally made it all the way to the end of the river. We tried to see if we could see Russia. You can't. But we did see a lot of water. Apparently, what we weren't seeing was not actually the Bering Sea. It was the Yukon River is so powerful that it pushes fresh water about 50 miles offshore. And then there's a line of waves that just breaks where the Bering Sea hits the river way out there. We did not go out there to check that out. So we made our way back to Emonic. We had tried to time the tides so that we could ride the tide back in, but we totally screwed it up. So we paddled both upriver and up tide. And we passed out again for our last night on the river, across the river from Emonic. The next morning, we loaded up our boat, Beringia, for one final ride across the river. And we went to Emonic, we put the boat on a truck, and then we got on an airplane. And then we flew back over the Delta, and we flew not home, to Anchorage, but back to civilization. And this was the summer of 2009. Michael Jackson had just died, and that was the news of the summer. Everyone was talking about it. And so I got the deal. I was at the luggage counter, and there was a TV on, first TV I had seen in a long time, and there was a newsreel that was saying, custody battle rages over Jackson children, and I turned to the attendant and I say, oh, did Michael Jackson get a divorce? That's just, how far away from everything we had been. So Anchorage is a long ways from home, so we definitely weren't there yet. So from Anchorage, Rusty stayed there with our gear and I hitchhiked 800 miles all the way back to Carcross, Yukon. It took 2 days, and then from there, I drove 800 miles back to pick up Rusty, and then from there we drove 900 miles to Skagway. We weren't done yet. We still had something that we wanted to go out and see, because of course the miners didn't start in Bennett. They started in Skagway, and they would take the Chilkoot Trail up over the mountains to put it on the other side. And so if we wanted to get the full experience, we had to come and do the Chilkoot Trail, which is a 3-day backpacking trip. It's managed as an international national park. So we had brought backpacking gear specifically for this purpose. It starts in this beautiful valley. This is what that picture of the snowy mountains looks like in the summer. It's a pretty narrow pass at the top with some snow year round, maybe not anymore. And then on the other side, you go down through some lakes, and this is the true headwaters of the Yukon here, this snowfield that flows into this lake. And from there, we actually were able to start heading down, following the Yukon that we had now spent so much time on. And there's a lot more beautiful lakes. And finally, we saw the train that we had started our journey on 8 weeks before. And then we were finally back in Bennett, where 8 weeks before we had set off from this exact same spot. And now it was time to go home. So we loaded up the car, but we still had about 3 or 4 weeks left before the start of senior year. So we took our time. We turned this into a college road trip. We explored some more parts of northern Canada. On our way down, we stopped in Banff and Jasper. We stopped in Glacier. We stopped in Yellowstone and the Tetons, met up with some base friends. And then we drove south through the Rockies to my parents' home in Denver. And we turned east and headed back to base and back to senior year and back to the rest of our lives. And this trip was about 13 years ago. I graduated from base 12 years ago. And so being outside is still a really important part of my life. I still try to spend as much time as possible as I can, whether it's hiking, rafting, climbing, skiing, or canyoneering. Getting outside with Beatties is still a really something I try to prioritize as much as possible. Rusty and I are still friends. We climbed the highest mountain in Wyoming with another base kid 3 years ago. But unfortunately, we've also grown up a little bit. Rusty ended up marrying his college girlfriend, Ketner, and they now live in Seattle with their 1-year-old daughter. I have not done that. I have instead started 2 companies, and I'm trying to make a life for myself as an entrepreneur. And people will ask me, where would I get started on this entrepreneurial journey? Where did I first do this? And I answer that it was this trip, because this wasn't a business. It was just fun. But a lot of what went into making this trip possible are the exact same skills that I use today in trying to grow my business, because we had to plan for the trip. We had to prepare a budget to talk about how we were going to spend the money. We had to present it to the Otis community, and then they had to agree, and then we had to go through several rounds of interviews to make sure that we were credible and that we weren't just going to waste their money or die. And we finally were lucky enough to get funded. We executed our plan, and then we delivered a satisfactory result to all of the stakeholders involved. And I think that's really the important part. I think, when we're out there, when I was 22, when I was out on the Yukon, I was just there to have fun and to have this great adventure and to challenge myself and to do something I'd never done and to just escape from society for a few months. But I never really could have expected the trajectory that my life would take since then, and the ways in which all of these experiences would impact them today. Getting outside is about so much more than just the fun that we experience while we're out there, the friendships that we form and the skills that we learn, like the teamwork and the critical thinking, problem solving, decision making. Those are all skills and assets that will pay dividends for the rest of our lives in ways that we can never predict while we're out there. And that's why I know you all know that. I know it's why you're all here. It's why I'm here. And it's why I think programs like the Bates Outing Club are so important. And I know that, even though the Outing Club is going through some changes right now, kids are still going to be able to go out and have amazing adventures like this. And I know that 50 years from now, someone else is going to be standing here at the 150th talking about the amazing trip that they went on and the amazing impact that it's had on their lives. So I have a ton of people that I need to thank. First and foremost, basically Rusty Milholland, class of 2010. Thanks for being such an amazing companion out there in the boat. The Bates College Otis Fellowship, for those of you who are still lucky enough to be able to do this, check it out. It's pretty awesome. The Bates Outing Club, we used all their gear and, it made the whole trip possible. Our parents for letting us go and not being too worried. Our friends, and then really we met amazing, incredible people out there who live out there in this area that we were just there to visit as tourists, and they were so friendly and so supportive, and so we're just so grateful to them. And then finally, I'm grateful to all of you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for caring about the outdoors. Thank you so much for caring about the Bates Outing Club, and for ensuring that opportunities like this are available to Bates students and will continue to be forever. And so with that, I guess we're gonna go to questions somewhere else, but that's it.